Doctrine and Covenants 98 through 101. Have you ever felt like no matter how hard you try, things just don't work out the way you planned and hoped? That's what it probably felt like for the Saints in Missouri in 1833. They had gathered there in the hopes of building Zion, and by the summer of 1833, there were an estimated 1,200 church members in Missouri, including 3 small children who had just arrived. You see, in August of 1833, church member John Murdock was called to go on a second mission. But John was a widow with 3 young children at home. What was he supposed to do with them while he was away? The revelation in Doctrine and Covenants 99 instructed John to send his children to live with Bishop Edward Partridge in Missouri. John was obedient to the command and sent his children to live with the Partridges and then left for a 2-year mission. Missouri, meanwhile, wasn't necessarily the safest place to send your children to live. The original settlers of Jackson County were concerned by the significant cultural and political and religious differences they had with the incoming members of the church, all 1,200 of them. The local Missourians also learned that church members thought Jackson County was some sort of promised land, which in their minds meant that more Latter-day Saints would be immigrating and would eventually take over the county. This obviously created conflicts between local residents and the Saints, and these misunderstandings and conflicts built up until in July 1833, a group of nearly 300 local Missourians signed a document calling for all Mormons, as they were known, to leave Jackson County. A committee delivered this document along with their demands that they leave the area and only gave them 15 minutes to respond. When church leaders didn't immediately comply, the more hostile members of the committee became an angry mob, destroying the church's printing shop and tarring and feathering Bishop Edward Partridge and local church member Charles Allen. But the violence didn't stop there. 3 days later, a mob of 500 men gathered to attack the Saints again. 6 local church leaders offered themselves as a ransom to protect the rest of the Saints. But the mob was not satisfied. They demanded that every Mormon leave Jackson County or die. Recognizing the futility of fighting back, Missouri church leaders signed an agreement. Half of the Saints would leave by January 1st, and the other half would leave 4 months later. Recognizing the need for help, Oliver Cowdery immediately left for Kirtland to tell Joseph all that had happened. But he didn't arrive for 2 weeks. Just a few days before Oliver arrived, on August 9th, Joseph received the revelation in Doctrine and Covenants 98, in which the Lord encouraged peace and diplomacy in the face of persecution. This revelation, along with those in Doctrine and Covenants 94 and 97, were written in a letter to the Saints in Independence and sent to the Missouri Saints 2 days before Oliver arrived in Kirtland. The Saints in Jackson received this letter in late August or early September, and it was a source of comfort and direction for them in the face of so much uncertainty and conflict. Taking counsel from the revelation, Missouri church leaders began working to find legal protection both from the unruly mobs and the order to leave Jackson County by the next spring. However, the church's legal actions, which also included hiring attorneys to represent them, only convinced the mob that church members wouldn't be leaving unless they were driven out. It was in late October, before the church's case could be heard in court, that vigilantes drove members from their homes in Jackson County. The members fled to neighboring counties, including Clay County. Though persecution continued in Missouri, missionary work flourished in other areas through the summer and fall of 1833. In September, a new church member, Freeman Nickerson, rode into Kirtland seeking a meeting with Joseph. He and his wife Huldah had been baptized a few months earlier in Perrysburg, New York, about 140 miles away. Brother Nickerson made a bold request. Would the prophet travel with him back to his home in New York and beyond to Mount Pleasant in Upper Canada, modern-day Ontario, and preach the gospel to his family and friends, specifically his 2 sons, Moses and Eleazar? Though Joseph had plenty to do in Kirtland and Missouri, he decided to make the journey. On October 5th, 1833, Joseph and Sidney Rigdon set out for a 1-month trip to New York and Upper Canada. Upon arriving in Perrysburg on October 12th, a week's journey from Kirtland, the 27-year-old Joseph wrote in his journal, "I feel very well in my mind the Lord is with us, but I have much anxiety about my family." Joseph had left Emma and their 2 small children back in Kirtland. Not only would Emma be left alone with heavy responsibilities, but a recently excommunicated member in Kirtland, Dr. Philastus Hurlburt, had begun an aggressive campaign to discredit Joseph and to inflict harm on Joseph and his family. In response to Joseph's worries, the Lord gave the revelation in Doctrine and Covenants 100 to soothe his heart and calm his fears. The Lord told Joseph and Sidney, Thus saith the Lord unto you, your families are well, they are in mine hands. Joseph and Sidney returned a few weeks later, and Joseph's records show that he found his family well according to the promise of the Lord. Not only was Joseph and Sidney's mission a success, but the growth of the church in that region would continue. It would be on a later mission to the same region of Upper Canada that Parley P. Pratt, upon an introduction from Moses Nickerson, would teach another important convert to the church, John Taylor, the future prophet. This is considered a direct result of the effectual door that would be opened by Joseph and Sidney on that first mission. But while the mission was a success, when Joseph returned, he found that things in Missouri were no better. On October 31st, 1833, a mob began raiding the area surrounding Independence, demolishing and burning homes, whipping men, driving families into the woods, and even vandalizing the church-owned Gilbert and Whitney store. A few days later, the violence escalated. Gunshots were fired, and 2 Missourians and 1 church member were killed. The stories of the event became exaggerated among Missourians, and rumors spread that church members had joined forces with Indian tribes and were threatening death to Missouri mob members. It was these rumors that became the basis for Lieutenant Governor Lilburn Boggs to call out the Missouri militia, who took the Saints' guns and thus their ability to protect themselves. Orson Hyde and John Gold relayed the news of the attacks and the condition of the Saints in Missouri to the prophet, who also received a letter from Bishop Edward Partridge bearing the same news. Joseph was overwhelmed with grief as he heard the plight of the Missouri Saints, and wrote a letter back to Bishop Partridge telling him that he didn't know why the Lord was afflicting Zion, and that he didn't yet understand how Zion would be restored. But Joseph continued to pray and ask the Lord for guidance. A few days later, on December 16th and 17th, 1833, in response to the pleadings of Joseph and the other leaders in Kirtland, the revelation in Doctrine and Covenants 101 was received. This revelation reaffirmed that sin leads to trials, and complacency in following the Lord's commands can lead to hardship. The members in Independence hadn't obeyed the Lord's commands to buy land, consecrate their possessions, or build a temple on the Lord's timeline, and he wasn't happy about it. However, despite the currently depressing condition of the Saints in Missouri, the Lord commanded them not to sell their land that was legally owned and consecrated. Even though the Saints would end up being expelled from the land, it was still the Lord's. Though Zion in Missouri might be postponed, it was not finished. It was becoming clear to the Saints, like John Murdock and those in Missouri, that being part of the Lord's church was an exercise in sacrifice of their will and often their comfort. But what the Lord had in store for them as they made these sacrifices was greater than the early saints could have imagined. And the same is true for us. And that's what's happening in Come Follow Me this week.